Welcome back to The Explainer. So glad you're here. Look, in our past discussions, we've covered a ton of ground on designing and validating medical device sterilization processes. But today we're talking about reality. We're stepping out of that pristine, perfect environment of initial validation and diving headfirst into the messy, unpredictable real world. We're zeroing in on Module 5, Routine Control, Release, Requalification, and Suppliers. Basically, we're going to explore exactly how we defend that hard-earned validated state day in and day out, batch by batch, year by year. So let's get right into it.
Okay, let's dive into this with a question that, honestly, might ruffle a few feathers. If your routine sterility test passes, is your product safe to release? Sounds like a simple yes, right? Well, that right there gets to the heart of a massive industry myth. A lot of people just assume a clean sterility test is the ultimate green light. But as we're going to see today, relying on a routine sterility test as your main release gate, it's not just bad practice, it fundamentally misunderstands how we actually guarantee patient safety.
Section 1. The validated state decays, defending the shield against real-world drift.
I want you to think of your initial validation not as a finish line you just cross and forget about, but rather like a protective shield you've built. And literally, the second you finish building it, real-world drift starts trying to tear it down. See, validation is a continuous life cycle. Step 1 is, of course, achieving that documented validated state. But then Step 2 inevitably happens, real-world drift. Equipment wears out, sensors drift a little, maybe suppliers subtly change their material formulations without making a bit fuss, and operators come and go. So Step 3 is our daily defense, routine monitoring that's designed specifically to catch that drift. And finally, Step 4 shows how we restore our shield through requalification and change control. The bottom line here? If you aren't actively defending your validated state, you are actively losing it.
And this whole idea is captured perfectly by Discipline Rule 2, sterility testing does not control the process. You know, a routine end product sterility test is, statistically speaking, incredibly weak. I mean, it only samples a tiny fraction of a batch, and it is entirely incapable of detecting a 1 in a million failure rate. And remember, that 1 in a million is exactly the standard we're aiming for. Instead, routine release has to rest on process evidence. Did every single unit in the batch go through the exact physical parameters we proved during validation? That is your real basis for release.
Because we rely on process evidence, we basically have two main avenues for product release. First up, microbiological release. This relies on incubating a biological indicator, a BI, placed inside a challenge device. It gives you direct evidence of microbial kill, sure, but it's slower because, well, you have to wait days for incubation. It's really common in routine EO, for instance. Alternatively, we have parametric release. This uses physical or dosimetric data only. No routine BIs required at all. It's way faster, but, and this is a big but, it demands incredibly tight, highly capable instrument control to prove the physics actually achieved the required lethality. Notice the key takeaway here. Neither of these is a routine end product sterility test.
Section 2. Routine Control and Release. The Daily Defense.
Now, without reteaching exactly how all these sterilization methods actually work, let's just focus on the specific physical evidence we monitor. For ethylene oxide, we need meticulous, rock-solid records of temperature, humidity, gas concentration, and time. For radiation, the ultimate release data is the delivered dose confirmed by dosimeters to be sitting right there within our validated minimum and maximum limits. And for moist heat, it's temperature, time at the hold phase, and steam saturation. We aren't testing for sterility. We are hunting for physical proof that the cycle stayed strictly within its validated limits.
So what does a formal batch release actually look like in practice? It's a very strict workflow. First, you gather all your cycle and parameter records. Second, you confirm those parameters perfectly match the validated limits, no guessing allowed. Third, you verify that the instruments measuring those parameters were actually in calibration, and you check any BI results if you're using them. Fourth, you make absolutely sure there are no open deviations affecting that batch. Only then do you reach Step 5, where a specifically defined authorized person actually signs off to release the product. It's a formal, evidence-based decision every single time.
Section 3. Requalification triggers and cadence. Periodic checkups and unexpected curveballs. So how exactly do we handle those routine periodic checkups and, more importantly, the unexpected curveballs reality loves to throw our way? Look at this timeline. At month 0, you've got your initial validation. Then, every month following, you're conducting your routine data reviews. Then, let's say around month 12, you hit your scheduled periodic requalification. That's a deliberate calendar event just to reconfirm validity. But, and this is crucial,
We also have to be ready for event-triggered requalification, which can happen literally anytime an unexpected shift occurs in our operations.
So what exactly are those curveballs that force an immediate requalification? Well, sure, the defined calendar interval is totally predictable. But you also have to react to adverse data trends, catching a slow drift before it becomes a massive catastrophic failure. If you repair, relocate, or perform major maintenance on a chamber, you requalify. If you've had, say, a dozen minor changes that are suddenly adding up, or if your incoming product bioburden unexpectedly shifts, you can not just wait for the calendar to tell you what to do. You requalify right then and there.
Section 4. Proportional Response to Change. Discipline Rule 6.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how we handle changes, because change is inevitable, but panic is completely optional. There's an absolute mantra of change management in sterilization, and it goes like this: assess every change for impact and revalidate in proportion to risk. Neither ignore it nor reflexively repeat the entire validation. This is the sweet spot right here. You don't bury your head in the sand, but you also don't burn down the building and start from scratch every single time a minor component swaps out.
To actually execute that proportional response, you follow this workflow. Step 1, you formally raise the change within your quality system. Step 2, logically, and I mean really thoroughly, assess its impact on sterility, materials, and packaging integrity. Step 3, based on that careful assessment, you decide on the proportional revalidation scope. And finally, Step 4, approve and implement. Taking the time to assess before acting, that is exactly what separates a tightly controlled process from total chaos.
Let's look at some concrete examples to see what proportional really looks like in the real world. Say you have a simple like-for-like consumable swap. Your proportional response is likely just a targeted verification documented in your system. No big deal. But what if you get a new supplier for your sterile barrier lid material? Well, then you need a partial revalidation focusing heavily on seal integrity and the microbial barrier. And if you make a massive, fundamental shift, like moving from ethylene oxide to radiation, yeah, that requires a full ground-up validation of the entirely new process. The effort always has to match the risk.
Let's ground this concept using a fictional case study, the NeoCath Secure. Imagine a scenario. Let's call it change SC06, where a new lid material supplier and a revised sealer are suddenly introduced. This clearly impacts seal integrity and EO breathability, right? Now, the proportional response here isn't to freak out and rerun the entire original PQ. No, it's to conduct a partial revalidation targeted specifically at the packaging and that breathability. It's a perfect example of addressing the risk scientifically without any unnecessary overreaction. And in this case, it actually fixed a notification gap in their supplier agreement.
Section 5. Managing Contract Sterilizers. The Outsourcing Dilemma.
I really want to let this next statement sink in. You can outsource the operation, but you cannot outsource the responsibility. Under EU MDR law and global regulations, the manufacturer placing the device on the market holds the ultimate, undeniable legal accountability for its sterility. Listen, it absolutely does not matter if a contract facility on the other side of the world was the one who pushed the button. At the end of the day, the responsibility is entirely yours. And this brilliantly illustrates this strict divide between execution and accountability. The manufacturer owns product conformity. They qualify and audit the supplier, and they make the final legal release decision. The contract sterilizer, they simply run the validated process, record the cycle data, and provide that data package back to you. Basically, they provide the evidence, you make the decision.
Now, to manage this critical relationship, handshakes and informal emails are completely useless. You need two robust, living documents. First, a quality agreement. This legally defines roles, responsibilities, mandatory change notifications, and your rights to actually audit their facility. Second, a technical agreement. This one explicitly lists the validated process parameters, calibration standards, and exactly what data must be included in that batch release package. Together, these two documents are what make your expectations genuinely auditable.
Going back to our fictional NeoCath Secure example with a company called Meridian Medical. So Meridian outsources their EO sterilization. Their technical agreement lists the exact temperature and humidity limits, while their quality agreement strictly mandates prior notice of any changes. When that lid material changed back in scenario SC06, having that quality agreement in place totally protected Meridian. It ensured they were notified before unvalidated product ever hit the market. It just proves why prior notification and these agreements in general are legally critical.
Section 6. Deviations in audit readiness. Proving your state of control. But what happens when things go wrong?
Because, let's be real, eventually they will. When a deviation occurs, say a sudden unexpected drop in chamber humidity, you have to follow a strict path. 1. Detect and immediately contain all affected product. 2. Investigate down to the true root cause, not just the surface symptom. 3. Assess the actual impact on product sterility. And 4. Formally disposition the batch. The absolutely crucial point here is that this entire workflow must be completed before a single unit from that batch goes out the door. You resolve the deviation first, you release second.
Which leaves us with this final, really important thought. If an auditor walked into your facility today, like right now, does your routine release data actually prove your process is still valid? Are you relying on weak sterility tests, or do you have rock-solid, calibrated process evidence? Do you assess changes proportionally, and are your contract sterilizers tightly bound by strict technical agreements? Look, defending the validated state is a daily discipline. I really hope today's explainer has given you the structured tools you need to look at your own records with a fresh, critical eye. Thank you so much for joining me today, and keep defending that shield.